for the lunch break. The Honourable Leanne Dalzell had the call, and the Honourable Leanne Dalzell has 4 minutes and 52 seconds remaining should she wish to continue with the call.
Mr Chairman.
I call on the Honourable Leanne Dalzell.
Mr Chairman, I've been very keen to get back to the regulatory impact analysis that was not included with the bill because this government, under the leadership of Rodney Hyde as the Minister for Regulatory Reform, has decided to take all regulatory impact statements out of the bills and to hide them away on the individual websites of the Ministry and of the Treasury. And I want to say that this regulatory impact statement would have to qualify as one of the most damning indictments on any government's process on any bill that I have ever seen in this Parliament in the 20 years since I was elected to represent people in Christchurch. So I think that I've got some justification for feeling pretty aggrieved about how the people in our area have been treated by this government. May I direct the House's attention to, of course, the regulatory impact analysis is unpaged. So let me just read out a quote under general discussion of options. Options that rely on introducing legislation in a very short time frame increase the risk of poor or misdirected intervention, resulting in unintended consequences and the need for subsequent intervention to remedy these consequences. Ad hoc intervention also potentially undermines the integrity and credibility of existing legislative provisions. However, in this instance, because any national level decisions on water management, particularly WCOs, which is included in this part of the bill, have the potential to undermine the government's New Start for Freshwater policy program and the work of the Land and Water Forum. It is considered preferable for any intervention to have a narrow Canterbury-specific focus in the first instance. So this is the beginning. This is the beginning of a new approach that this government is going to have, and this is the end of water conservation orders. And that's why I have a supplementary order paper on the table of this House to ask that the sections relating to water conservation orders be removed from the bill. And I hope I get the support of other members in this House. I don't think that government members or the parties that are supporting the government, particularly the Māori Party, I don't believe they fully appreciate the extent of what's happening to water conservation orders under this legislation. I honestly don't believe it has been fully explained, because it all becomes very clear when the regulatory impact analysis is actually analysed. Mr Chairman, it goes on to say the results of any intervention, that's here in Canterbury, and that's what Part 3 of this bill implements, the results of any intervention could provide useful information for decision makers on the outcomes of the New Start for Freshwater policy program and potentially an opportunity to trial alternative policy settings in a confined context. So actually, Canterbury is now the scene of an experiment for the government's wider policy objectives with the New Start for Freshwater policy program. I am deeply alarmed to find this in the regulatory impact analysis. No commentary on this agenda is contained within the explanatory note on the bill. We have to go to the regulatory impact analysis no longer contained with these bills to find that this is the government's objectives. Now, another point in the regulatory impact analysis says this, and I think it's relevant that the Minister has not commented on this, and I think with the Minister and the Chair perhaps he could take up this particular issue because it is within his broader portfolio. Any intervention that alters the nature of the relationship between Ngāi Tahu and the body responsible for governance and decision-making on natural resources, particularly water, will need to be designed in light of the Crown's treaty responsibilities. In particular, Commissioners will individually and or collectively need to have a strong understanding of the Ngāi Tahu perspective, rights and interests. Not once have we actually heard the Minister talk about how that is going to be addressed in the context of implementing Part 3, because Part 3 creates a whole new paradigm for water conservation orders, and actually if we go through the regulatory impact statement, we find out that the government's a little bit concerned. Mr Chairman?
I call the Honourable Leanne Dalzell.
We actually find that the government's a little bit concerned about the nature of the requirements for assessing water conservation orders, which is why my SOP becomes all the more important. Mr Chairman, it states in the regulatory impact analysis that one of the options was to put together this whole question of water conservation orders, and the concern that was expressed was that this would displace the statutory purpose of WCOs as an instrument for protecting outstanding amenity or intrinsic values of water bodies, and would allow decisions on the allocation of water from these water bodies to be made in the context of sustainable management of resources. Now, I actually think the Minister should actually talk to us about this particular issue, because what it does seem to do is it does seem to be a very deliberate decision of the government to shift from the conservation values that are behind our water conservation orders in one part of the RMA to the other part of the RMA, which talks about sustainable management of resources. And I actually think that if the Minister is doing this as part of a long-term objective to shift this over time throughout New Zealand, then actually this is not the way to do it. And to have an experiment in Canterbury to see whether we can trial a different way of doing things down there is actually quite untenable. Now, Mr Chairman, the regulatory impact analysis contains 3.5 pages rather, on option 1. So a regulatory impact statement requires the government to set out what the objectives are, then to set out the range of options, and then to analyse each of those options, do a bit of a risk analysis, to do a bit of opportunity costing and various other tests to be applied. We're looking at the risks and the benefits of the particular approach. 3 pages on option 1, which is the legislation to replace ECAN councillors with commissioners, half a page on the other 4 options each. So we've got option 2, legislation appointing commissioners to take over resource management functions only, legislation replacing council with commission tasked with transitioning to Canterbury Regional Water Authority, which I believe is still on the agenda. Mr Chairman, option 4, implement the Canterbury Water Management Strategy. And actually it's quite interesting when one looks under that. It says the vision and principles of the Canterbury Water Management Strategy seek balance between environmental, economic, social and cultural outcomes, but this balance is to be achieved under the overarching presumption of more reliable water and more intensive land use, an outcome that has not been subject to assessment against the purpose of sustainable management set down in the RMA. So even the regulatory impact analysis, in ruling out one of the options that is actually being implemented by this bill, is inconsistent with the provisions that the Minister really ought to be operating under with respect to the RMA. Mr Chairman, it also goes on to say the potential inconsistency between the overarching presumption behind the vision and principles of the CWMS and the purpose of the RMA has implications for the planning framework in Canterbury post-intervention. Well, that would have to be the understatement of the year. Of course it's got implications post-intervention, but actually I'd really like to hear the Minister talk about it, because not once have any of these issues been raised in the debate so far. So we're passing legislation under urgency where we haven't had an opportunity to have a rigorous debate about these things that really matter in Canterbury and indeed matter around the country. Option 5 is using the existing RMA intervention powers, and option 6 was targeted assistance to Environment Canterbury, which was actually based on the proposal that Environment Canterbury put back to the Minister. And actually, to be honest, this didn't even get a fair hearing in my view, because the government had already decided they were going with option 1, and this option, which was actually proposed by Environment Canterbury, was really ruled out beforehand. Mr Chairman, I want to talk about how other government departments responded to the consultation after this. I really am quite shocked to find all of this detail in a document that wasn't even tabled with the bill. Mr Chairman, as a result of the consultation with a number of government departments,